start when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Trivette. Welcome everybody here on the panel and those who are watching from home. We are again another month exercising an abundance of caution to help ensure everybody's safety during these COVID times. But I think hopefully next month we'll be back in person. So with that, welcome to the Williamsburg City Council virtual meeting of April 5th. Ms. Felica, would you call the roll?
Mr. Rogers.
Here.
Ms. Ramsey.
Here.
Mayor Pons.
Here.
Vice Mayor Dent.
Here.
Mr. Maslin.
Here.
Thank you. So that takes us to item A under 3, council preview. Mr. Trivette.
Yes, so for Thursday's meeting, we have 4 public hearings related to the budget's adoption, which we plan to do in May, but the public hearings will be on Thursday. And then under new business, we have several items. The first is a report and hopefully an action item on the Hampton Roads Workforce Council and the merger of 2 workforce boards. We have the annual asphalt pavement and resurfacing contract award of bid and an award of bid for the construction of field number 4 at Kiwanis Park.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so we're going to next go to public comment. Hopefully we can make this happen seamlessly if there's anybody on. Emmanuel or Mr. Trivette, do you know if we have any speakers on for public comment?
We do not, and I did test the system to make sure it was working, and it was, so there's nobody there.
Okay, so that takes us to...
I will say, Mayor, that under public comment, we did receive some email traffic about the budget. Obviously, most of that has made its way to you all by now. We did receive 1 official public comment form, and I think Sandy has sent that to you as well.
And those will all be part of the record moving forward. Is that correct?
Only the items sent in under the public comment form would be entered into the record. Everything else is just sort of information in our email traffic. If somebody wanted something added to the record, they need to send in a public comment form or tell us in their email that that's their intent.
Okay, fair enough. Good. Okay, so then that takes us to item 4, background presentations. Presentation and discussion concerning the FY22 City Manager's proposed budget. Mr. Trivette, Ms. Dameron.
Yeah, I'm going to start us off here today, and we're going to walk you through the FY22 budget message. And the intention there is not to do a rehash of the entire budget retreat that we did in February. Obviously, we don't have that much time. Not a lot has changed, so the purpose of today's conversation is to sort of just cover what the budget is, what's in, what's out, answer your questions, and get the dialogue started. The timeline moving forward is that we would complete discussion today. Staff has basically 30 days then to make any changes or alterations following Thursday's public hearings, and then present to you again at the May work session anything that's been made different about the budget in preparation for what we hope would be adoption at the Thursday meeting in May. So let me share my screen here.
Mr. Trivette, would you like us to hold our questions till after you make your presentations, or would you feel comfortable entertaining them as we go through? I know we generally wait, and we can do that, but
yeah, I think entertain them as we go through. As I said, I'm not going to go into tremendous detail today because the budget is so similar to what you saw in February. And unlike some years where we used this opportunity to educate the public, we did send a letter out to every resident and property owner in the city. So at this point, I think most people are aware of the budget and what's in the content of it. So we'll do sort of a light coverage today. And then at the end of what I've got to say, Barbara Dameron is going to go over some of the proposed policies that we're working on that would be included in the adoption packet in May. So certainly, if you've got questions as we go, feel free to ask them.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm just going to share my screen. Is everybody seeing the budget message? Okay, yes. Great. So, the budget message is really a document. If you look at any local government budget, you're going to find a budget message or a transmittal letter, just depending upon the organization. And it's really the manager's opportunity to summarize the budget, cover the important topics, while at the same time meeting the requirements for hopefully a distinguished budget award from the Government Finance Association Officers Award. So that's what we attempt to do here. And as you know, a couple years ago, we redesigned our budget message from a letter format with very little graphical appeal to this much more streamlined and hopefully attractive and engaging document. On the first page, I sort of outline the theme. You know, I like for our budgets to have a theme. We've been successful at that for the last few years. And this year's theme is important because we actually borrowed it from a GFOA article on recovering from financial distress. And what the article basically said is that financial leadership coming out of financial distress is broken into 3 phases: bridge, reform, and transform. And as we sat down and started talking about the FY22 budget, it dawned on us that that's exactly the exercise we had undertaken without having read the GFOA's guidelines on how to recover. And so you can break down what we've done with this budget and what we've done really with the last 2 budget years into those 3 categories of bridge, reform, and transform. The bridging effort really occurred as we began to analyze how we were going to make it through COVID-19's impacts on our budget. And as you all know, we did that by using existing revenues to bridge the gap of the revenue shortfall. And as we come now into essentially the 3rd fiscal year that's been impacted by COVID-19 mitigation, we know that we've still got some time to bridge. And that's why this budget focuses on continuing to use some reserve, CIP funds, as well as transfer from the tourism fund to overcome budget deficits. The reform aspect of this budget is establishing new practices and increasing revenue where needed so that coming out, we are prepared to transform the budget so that we exit the pandemic stronger than we entered it and in a position to move ahead with our community plans, despite a pandemic largely putting all of that on hold. As I said in my budget message, I like to think of this pause created by COVID-19 as a pregnant pause, where on the other side of it, our community is refreshed and new, able to take advantage of the opportunities that come our way. So the 6 funds that we have in our overall city budget, the total prepared for you as the FY22 budget is $64 million, which is just a little bit increased from previous years. And we'll talk about that as we move through the message. So on the next page of the budget message, what we try to do is summarize the drivers of the budget. And every year this is going to change a little bit. Obviously, there's going to be some constant factors, and those are reflected here. The first one is a new one, though, and this is really the subject matter of the community letter that we sent out about the proposed tax increase. And it is the imbalance in the capital improvement plan. One of the things I think has been hard for people to understand about the structural imbalance, which is, you know, a technical term for what exists, is this existed prior to COVID-19. And it was something that we were working on a strategy to deal with. And that strategy included raising revenue, i.e. a tax rate increase of some variety over a period of years. And, you know, Ms. Dameron and I are really looking at 2 or so years from this fiscal year, implementing a gradual increase in real estate taxes to overcome the imbalance. Effectively making sure that we had a general fund surplus every year that was healthy enough to accomplish the goals and tasks set before us in the capital improvement plan. What COVID-19 did is move that timeline up and made the problem urgent. And the reason is because every year we transfer money from the general fund to the CIP to accomplish those projects. And when the general fund runs a deficit, then we don't have that money to transfer. In fact, we're taking money from the CIP through the elimination or postponement of projects, the capture of reserves or contingency funds from the CIP to balance the general funds budget. And so for the last 2, almost 3 fiscal years, that's what's been happening. The net effect of that is the reserve for the general fund, the overall reserve of the city, gets depleted faster and faster as we try to accomplish what we need to keep city services what the city residents are accustomed to. So the tax increase is proposed to overcome that problem. As you know, coming out of the pandemic, we anticipate significant needs in the school system. We've been talking about school construction now for a number of years. We don't know what form that construction might take. It could be an elementary school, it could be new preschool facilities. At one point, we were even talking about high school expansion or construction. What we do know is that as we exit the pandemic, as enrollment continues to grow and returns back to pre-pandemic levels, those conversations will again intensify, and those projects will move up in the capital improvement plan. The tax increase that we've proposed, the real important piece of it is that all 8 cents is required, so that at the end of the capital plan's horizon, 5 years, the balance of the CIP is positive, but not overflowing in a surplus. So if you look at those forecasts, what you'll see in the CIP is a projected balance of about $8,000 after all of those projects are paid for over a 5-year period. What that allows us to do is borrow funds in a balanced method. So we borrow funds for general government projects, such as the library project in the future and the police station more immediately. And we finance through pay-as-you-go methodology the school projects. Now, the reason that that's important and the reason that we do that in balance is so that we don't negatively affect the city's credit rating. Taking on too much debt at one time certainly would impact our credit rating. So a lot of people ask, why is credit rating important? Well, you know, a city government has a credit rating not unlike you or I have a credit rating. If we go to buy a car, they're going to do a credit check. And our credit could be anywhere from 800 to 500 or 600 points. And depending upon where you are in that scale determines your credit worthiness. And that translates into how much the borrowed money costs you, how much interest you pay over time. The same thing applies to city government. The lower our credit rating, the more we're going to pay for borrowed funds. So over time, it's very important that we keep that credit rating as healthy as it can be. So that's why that strategy is so critical. And we really believe that the full 8-cent increase puts us in a position to move the city forward and accomplish those tasks without overburdening us with additional debt, as well as keeping the funds healthy, rebuilding the reserve, and paying for those important CIP projects. We've, of course, talked about COVID-19 till everybody is tired of saying those words, and hopefully we're getting close to a point where it'll be in the past. But for now, it's still a very real impact, and particularly on this budget. You know, some of the questions that we still don't have answers to is how long COVID-19's mitigation, concern, consumer confidence will be a factor in the overall economy of Williamsburg. As tourism returns, and we know that it will, it may take time. It may happen all at once. It may somewhat look like a bubble where we have pent-up demand being released all at one time and then slowly approaching normal in a period of months and a period of years. So it's still an uncertainty. So we have to be cautious as we do revenue estimates, not to overestimate revenues, and certainly not to underestimate them too significantly. Schools, we've talked about that every year. This is a factor on our budget. You know, we pay for the school system through a contractual obligation with James City County. Right now, that contract is about 9.68% of the overall cost, both on the operational side and on the capital side. That contract is up for renewal in a year. So we will begin in the next fiscal year negotiating the content of it. I expect it will largely look the same with some minor amendments. One of the things that changed in our budget this year is normally we would show a transfer of funds associated with sales tax for education from the city to the school system. And this year we agreed, as did the county, to allow that transfer to happen between the state and the school system directly. And so our budget reflects that change. As we go through the school year, you know that we do pay operational costs. There's been a lot of discussion about the fact that the governor's budget includes a 5% tax increase. I think we would be remiss if we didn't take the opportunity to let the public know that a 5% increase proposed by the governor does not cover the full cost of a 5% increase to the school system, because so much of the school system's operating costs are paid for by the localities. And so while the governor suggests and pays for a select amount of the 5% increase, the overall burden for that money actually applies to localities. This budget reflects the superintendent's budgeted amount for increases in operational costs. It also reflects the amended CIP that was proposed by the school board that reflects pushing out some projects due to lower enrollment over time. As I said before, though, it doesn't take those projects off the horizon. Eventually, they will come due. And so our strategy now for the last few years has been to build up a school project reserve within the CIP so that when those big projects come due, we don't have the overall burden of the whole cost on the CIP budget. We're successful. We built up a balance. Unfortunately, it's been zeroed out due to COVID-19, but now we need to start building it back. So again, that's why the tax increase is important. And then the final point on this page is the reserve policy. This is always going to be a concern. The city of Williamsburg's financial strength really lies in the fact that we have such a healthy reserve. Our policy is 35%. We try very hard not to go below 35%, and for many years have not. We have told you in previous years that there's the operational practice that Ms. Dameron and I prefer of having 40%, and we were working on building that up when COVID-19 hit. And we're thankful that we were, because had we just been at the policy level of 35%, the impact would be even more severe. As we come out of the pandemic, we anticipate that we will actually be at about 31% in the calculation of that reserve policy, which is below our financial policy amount of 35, which is one of the reasons why we're proposing a new financial policy on how to repay those funds over time. Again, that goes back to the credit rating issue. As credit raters look at us in the next year, they're going to want to see a plan for recovering that lost balance. And our financial policy is that plan. As you can see on the right, we try to highlight some of the important factors. Overall, the impact of COVID-19 so far is about $12.8 million on the city's budget. The cost per student actually dropped a little bit this year based on enrollment, so $9.6 thousand. The tax increase that's shown there is based on the proposed tax rate increase of 8 cents. And this is accounting for the fact that you're actually receiving a tax bill twice a year. So that 155 is shared over 2 bills. And then the reserve policies, I said, we're counting on being at around 31% at the close of the fiscal year. I want to pause there and just mention another question that has come forward as a result of our community letter and our discussions about the budget has been, what does the city plan to do with CARES Act funding? We can expect to get some. We don't exactly know the timeline, but it's getting close to delivery. We don't know what the rules are yet. We're told to expect less rules, but certainly we've already seen some that have come out of the federal government, and the Treasury Department is continuing to work on a complete list. So we know there will be some restriction. Ultimately, though, it's our hope that whatever funds might come can be applied to revenue recovery, essentially making up lost revenue associated with COVID-19. And if that is the case, it will be our recommendation that the bulk of that money be applied toward paying down what we have to take from the reserve to operate during the year, or repaying the reserve balance. What that does is allows us to get back to normal operations much faster and consider lowering that tax rate as soon as possible. The other reason that that money is not reflected in this budget is, as I said, so much is still uncertain. How we can use it, when we're going to receive it, all of those things are just unknowns. And so the wise thing to do is not have that money figured into an overall revenue plan. On the next page, we talk about the special funds. So on this page, we're going to start with tourism fund. The city created the tourism fund as a result of the increased sales tax in the Historic Triangle, designed to increase tourism marketing and tourism product. The city decided to take its share of that funding and put it in a special fund that was reserved for new tourism product development. And we were successful. In the first year, we gave out several grants, allowing new products to be considered, and many of those are moving ahead now. Unfortunately, COVID-19 made us reconsider how to use that funding. So in the last couple of years, we've captured it to help balance the budget. And so if you read the budget message, what you'll see here is we're still anticipating transferring money out of the tourism fund to accomplish that goal. This still falls within the original proposal that we made to City Council on the balancing. So it's no additional money out of the tourism fund than what we had already forecasted. I think the main thing that changed here as we went through the process of dealing with COVID-19 is our timeline was a little off. We anticipated making this transfer last year and did not have to do that. So certainly, though, as we come to the close of this fiscal year, we anticipate taking the lion's share of that money to balance the budget and overcome the deficit that's resulted from COVID. On the capital improvement project fund, we've talked a lot about that. The total budget this year is about $11.6 million worth of projects. Many of those are projects that were already on the books or were grant funded. There is still a healthy amount of projects there requiring funding from sales tax and, of course, a transfer from the general fund, including $828,000 in school maintenance and construction projects. That does not include any major capital construction for the school system. That's all forecasted in future years. Then we have the utility fund, and often this is a fund that gets neglected. This is not something we spend a lot of time on, but it's important to note the city operates a full water utility. The utility fund is an enterprise fund, and what that means is the revenues and expenses are not commingled between any other fund. It's self-supporting, or at least that's its design. And thankfully, our utility is in fact self-supporting. We manage it through the rate setting each year. Right now, we are not asking for a rate increase in the utilities, but we will be probably in the next few years. As consumption continues to drop, those costs of operating the facilities do not, and so we will be looking at an increase at some point. We did change out the chart this year, if you notice, from sort of that text version of what the regional rates were to this bar graph, and hopefully it's a little bit more clear that even with the HRSD surcharge that's applied to your water bill here in Williamsburg, our rate is the lowest in the region. And then lastly on this page is debt capacity. This is something that's very important. I certainly believe that debt should be used like a tool. And so as we move through the process of bonding projects, this is what we consider. Obviously, bonding money, borrowing money, as you would call it in your own life, does include a debt payment every year. And so as the more we borrow, the more we have to pay. We're well below the state's debt cap. I don't think we'll ever consider approaching that, and have our own policy on how much debt we can take on. One of the new policies we'd like to see adopted clarifies that. And so Barbara and I have been talking about how to structure that as part of your budget adoption in May. So what's included in the budget? On this page, we talk about personnel costs. In this budget, there are no personnel costs associated with wage increases. The significant increases are in sort of the non-discretionary departmental issues associated with personnel, particularly insurance costs and things like that. So in public safety, you can see there's an increase. Most of that increase is associated with things that we really can't impact, including the additional personnel in the fire department that were already authorized, a portion of which are grant funded, as well as increases in the regional jail operation. Under general government, we have some increases associated with changes in the electoral board and upcoming elections. We also have, as I said, the healthcare plan increases. It's interesting to note that despite a decrease in the city's health insurance costs from the provider, our health insurance costs actually increased this year. And the reason for that is because as employees elect to go from, say, a single coverage plan to a dual or a family plan, our cost increases as well. So it's important to note that that's a change. And then, of course, we do have some personnel changes included in that. We'll talk about those in a second. Educational costs, $152,000 in increases there. Public Works includes some changes associated with contracts that escalate over time. As again, we said, health insurance benefits, and Human Services has a minor increase associated with some personnel as well. So overall, our FTE count is going to grow by 2.5 positions. The majority of that is several part-time positions, including upgrading an existing position to the assistant city manager role. As you know, we had downgraded that position and now we're taking it back to that level. We're prepared to start advertising that in the next week or so. We'd like to add a graphic design specialist, as you know, and as you can see, we spend a lot of time working on that now. And the reason is because communication is just so important. And what I'd like to do is realize the efficiency of staff so that we don't spend so much time doing graphical design work, which we really don't have expertise in. An IT specialist to help us keep up with the call volume associated with the IT desk, and that'll be a part-time position, as well as a couple of positions in human services. Now, what's interesting about the human services position is sort of like the assistant city manager, a lot of that money is already accounted for in the budget as the state provides a lion's share of the cost of the salaries and benefits for those positions. And that's why you see the FTE count moves to 220 from 217, and it's only 2.5 positions that are added. So then the obvious question is what's not included? And on this page, we try to summarize that for you. As I said, we did go through the capital plan and scrub out or move out projects that were not mission critical. These are projects like community sidewalks that are very much desired and certainly something that are warranted, but not mission critical in next budget year. So we've moved those out, and the total value of those projects is about $900,000. General operations, there are no cost increases associated with wages. So the typical cost of living increase and the very much desired merit increase are not included in this budget. Parking is an interesting conversation. In this budget, we sort of got a negative shown here of $262,000, and that's because we are not including parking revenue at this point. It is our intention to address parking revenue prior to adoption. As you all know, one of the things that you set for us as a goal was to make the Prince George parking garage free for users to some degree, and so we're working through those plans. We also talked about implementing the 2016 parking study, as well as the 2017 parking study implementation plan, which called for paid parking on street, managing the Colonial Williamsburg parking lots so that for the user, it feels like a seamless experience. We think we have found the answer to our parking dreams and are evaluating those opportunities now. We want to make sure that whatever revenues we forecast are realistic and conservative, as well as talk to other communities that are already using the system. One advantage to where we are now with parking is that we have the experience of Passport behind us. And so we know what we like, we know what we don't like. And so as we talk to other communities that are already using something else, we can ask them how those issues are handled and know going in what to expect. So we're excited about this change, and again, hope to have that reflected in the budget prior to adoption. Multiple departments represents the process of the budget development, where we meet with each department, all the constitutional officers, and several of the outside agencies to talk about budget needs in the upcoming fiscal year. We compile that information, we compare it to revenues that have been forecasted, and then we know what the deficit is, right? Or we know what the surplus might be. And that tells us what we can afford and what we can't. And, you know, in this year's process, as Ms. Dameron and I sat down to do that, the problem was obvious. We did not have enough revenue for what had been requested. So one of the things that we did was we told all the departments they had to roll their requests back to FY21 levels. And so the $78,000 represented there is that change. In human services, they asked for one position that was not funded by the state, and that position was not included in the budget. And in the police department, there were $50,000 worth of requests that we also put off and out of the FY22 proposed budget. As you know, the #1 priority for the police department is a take-home vehicle program, which is the one new project reflected in the capital improvement plan for the police department. So that brings us to where does the future take us? And there's a couple of things on this page are things to watch. #1 is what will be the duration of COVID-19 impacts. You know, we're still at this point coming through the edge. What we hope is the edge of COVID-19 impacts on the economy, but it's hard to tell for sure. Safety is still very much a concern. As the news continues to talk about variants and what those impacts might be, it's clear we're not out of the woods yet. And so we still need to be very cautious. #2 is confidence. What's the consumer confidence going to be coming off the pandemic? As people exit their homes and begin to spend in the way that they were, maybe even more than, how quickly will we return to normal and have a predictable revenue stream from those tourism taxes? And the last one is capacity. And this is something that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about. And that is, how many businesses have been forced to close and move on, and how will that impact our capacity for revenue generation? So things to consider, and this is where we talk about the transformation, is what types of fiscal policies do we need to put in place to make sure that our budget is on the right trajectory? What types of fiscal policies can we put in place that make sure those rating agencies have confidence that we're taking the right steps? And so we've identified 4 that we want to bring forward. The first is a process of reviewing the tax rate and determining when the time is right to lower it. And so we've looked at some examples from across the state, including one close to home, Hampton. Good policies, well thought out, with some drawbacks and some positives. And so we're going to try to craft a policy for the city to consider that will allow us a process of reviewing that rate periodically. Another one would be to stabilize the way that we actually calculate the reserve requirement of 35%. As you all know, right now, it's based on revenue in the last fiscal year and does not allow us to in any way account for one-time revenues that weren't expected. So as we come out of COVID and having received a large amount of CARES Act money and anticipate another large amount of American Recovery Plan money, we know that we're going to have this problem again and again, where the calculation of the 35% is artificially inflated by one-time revenues through grants. And so is there a way that we can change our policy to account for that, to make the 35% number more predictable? Another one is establishing a reserve policy for the utility fund, similar to what we have in the general fund. So these are all good policies that are important to moving us ahead, including the one I already mentioned, which is repaying the reserve from what we have taken from it to overcome COVID-19. So final thoughts, I try to summarize where I think we're going from here. And, the real basis of our budget, that the 8-cent tax increase, is designed not to create an overwhelming profit for the city, because we really have no benefit of that. What it does is it allows us to recover from COVID faster, rebuild the reserve that we've borrowed from, but more importantly, help stabilize the CIP and accommodate for those projects that are on the horizon. A lot of conversation about when do we think we can lower the tax rate, if that was possible. I would forecast maybe 3-4 years from now, we will have built up a war chest to accommodate those projects and really be in a position to consider that. Now, that's absent any overwhelming growth in revenue. As revenue grows, maybe associated with pent-up demand, maybe associated with a stronger or more robust drive economy as a result of COVID fears, then we move that timeline up. And so I can tell you, we're just as excited to consider a lower tax rate as we are to move ahead with this budget that meets the needs of the city. So with that, I'm happy to answer any budget related questions, or we can have Barbara talk about the policies and do questions at the end of that.
Do any members of council have any questions for Drew, or would you like to move forward with Ms. Dameron? Seeing no questions.
I was just going to say I'd like to move forward because her presentation may generate some additional questions and answer some as well.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ramsey. Ms. Dameron, would you go ahead, please?
Certainly. Good afternoon. And Drew has already alluded to the need to look at and review our financial policies. And so I want to take that just a little bit further. I want to talk about some of the benefits of why we have policies. And the city already has policies, and it's not uncommon during the budget process for those policies to be reviewed. Certainly, you don't want to change them too often, because the goal is to have strong policies that will serve you well through the years. But sometimes situations change and they need to be updated. So through that, we've identified 2 existing policies that we feel like need some updates, and we've identified 2 policies that don't currently exist that we believe would be beneficial to the city. So in speaking to the benefits of written financial policies that are adopted, the first is it assists elected officials and the staff in the management of the city. So it's good when there are decisions to be made that we can look at the results, analyze, look at the results, and then compare the outcome to our financial policies and see if that's in keeping with keeping the city financially stable. It's also one of the best practices recommended by the Government Finance Officers Association. The auditors also look at that because one of the things that they do is look, are we in compliance with the laws and things that we have adopted? And the rating agencies look to that because they want to know what financial policies we have and how does that speak to our ability to assure them that we're going to be able to pay our debts. It also garners confidence from the public, because not only can they look at those policies and understand them, but they can also use those policies, hold us accountable. It also provides continuity over time as city staff members change, as council members come and go. It's good that everybody has a written document to look back to and understand our policies. And then it just provides a good, strong foundation for the many decisions that the city has to make. So one of the ones that we mentioned refining is the general fund reserve policy. And a couple of things come to mind here that are important. First and foremost is to define the conditions that warrant the use of reserves. If we're just seeing a long-term small decrease in revenues, we may not want to dip into reserves for that. But certainly when there are crises such as the nature of COVID that impact our revenues suddenly and by a large amount, then that's a time that we may need to use those reserves. We also want to define when we have to use reserves, how long of a time period are we going to have for replenishing those, and what's the plan? How are we going to fund the replenishment? We also want to describe how our expenditure and revenue levels will be adjusted to match any new economic realities that we're facing, particularly if we don't think that they're going to be a one-time or a short duration. If this is something that has changed our trend lines, then we need to look at how we're going to change that so we don't continually use reserves as a financing bridge. And then we want to clarify how the reserve level will be calculated, not only so that there's not any confusion in that, but also that we soften the impact of any one-time revenue streams that come in. We don't want something that's going to fluctuate from one year to the next greatly. Then we have a new policy that we think is very important to look at, and that is a process for looking at the real estate rate and determining whether we should reduce that. And it also is good to have it as a guideline for just assisting in determining what that real estate tax rate should be. Again, we're continuing to do our research, but we feel that we need to tie this to some benchmarks, and some of those might be residents' income growth or decline, the assessed values, inflation rate, our general fund reserve balance. You know, are we below our policy level, or have we accumulated above where we think is a comfort level and good use of taxpayers' dollars? And then I'll also mention we need to look at this with a long-term range in mind, a minimum of a 5-year operating forecast. Again, if we're dealing with a short-term issue that may turn itself around in another year, we may not necessarily want to increase or decrease the rate. And that brings me to our debt service policy. And I think what we need here is to review and update the policy to establish and define some benchmarks. An example of those benchmarks to consider would be the debt to assessed value, your debt payout ratio, which is basically the amount of debt that you're going to pay down over a 10-year period, our debt service to expenditures. And again, just like we mentioned, fluctuations of a one-time nature in revenues, we want to consider that in expenditures too. Otherwise, we could have a debt service limit that's very high one year and make plans with that in mind, and then have it decrease substantially in the next year. And you're either going to break your own policy or you're going to have to pay down some debt, and that could be very difficult. And then finally, the debt to personal income. And then also utility working capital policy. You know, we already do a rate study that incorporates our working capital, but it's important to establish and define a working capital target level. So when we look at increases and decreases in that working capital, we have an understanding of whether we really need to increase the rate or whether we can maintain the rate. And again, it's important that this be over a long-term perspective, at least over the 5-year time period that we show the rate study. And we need to take into considerations with that also future capital improvement projects. We need to know what's on the horizon for the future, because again, we don't want to have a rate shot down the road because we haven't planned and looked at the future horizon. Again, the goal in this is just to assist in determining what the rate should be. So our next steps would be to review our existing policies under consideration, also to research best practices. And after we've done that research, we need to analyze the best practices and consider Williamsburg uniqueness. Our revenue trends, what's unique in our community, because not every community has the same trend line. We need to make sure that we clearly define the calculations so that we understand from year to year. And again, that speaks to continuity and knowing that we're calculating the same way and correctly each year. We also want to, once we have drafted the financial policies, we want to share them with our financial advisors and have them review it and offer comments and suggestions. They work with the rating agencies and many other communities on a daily basis. And so we think their input is very important. And our plan is to have a staff recommendation submitted for council's review and consideration at the May meeting. And that leads us to any questions you might have or comments.
Well, thank you, Ms. Dameron and Mr. Trivette. I guess before we kick it off, I just wanted to offer my compliments, certainly first to Mr. Trivette regarding the letter that went out to the community. I think it was obviously very well written. It was very easy for people to understand the message that was in the letter, so that, you know, they had a better sense of the intention behind a real estate tax increase. And I think without it, we would, you know, be faced with more people with more questions than they have now. And that's a result of the letter that you sent out. And so I appreciate that. And then also, Ms. Dameron, for everybody's work on the budget. And what I see in this budget is not something, you know, there's no great new fluff in here that the city manager is trying to push through on us. You know, there's good sound, physical, responsible thinking in this presentation. And so I just wanted to first give you all a compliment on presenting it. And I know it's difficult to present it with, you know, with an 8-cent tax increase, because that's scary to a lot of people. But again, I think you've done it in a way that makes sense, and it's easy for people to see the needs behind it. So with that, I'll turn over to council, or turn to council to see if there's any questions. Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. And I too also like to thank Mr. Trivette and Ms. Dameron for all the work, and for everyone involved in staff that worked to prepare this budget. And as you've already stated, it's proposing an 8-cent tax increase is a difficult decision. I'd also like to thank all the members of the community that have contacted us and offered input, offered suggestions. whether they agree or disagree, but that's an important part of the process, and encourage them to continue doing that as we work towards a May approval. Mr. Trivette, could you talk a little bit? I know you stated this earlier that obviously we didn't get in this situation in a year. It was projected, and you talked about at one point, considering gradually increasing the tax rate, and then obviously COVID had an impact on that. Could you talk about, just so I'm clear and others that are watching, that if we agree to a tax increase less than the 8 cent, what effect that has if we looked at a gradual increase now?
Sure. Basically, what we would be looking at is if the council elects not to do the full 8 cents that I have proposed, we would, with certainty, be looking at increasing the rate again next year or the year after that. Because the purpose of the increase is really to, as I said, primarily fund the CIP projects that are on the horizon, but also to recover from the amount of money that we've borrowed from ourselves, essentially out of the reserve. The longer that our general operating fund operates in a deficit, the more that impacts the overall fiscal health of the city. And that's why we need to take the 8 cent step now. Absent that, we're still going to be in the process of looking for revenue moving forward. The other part of that is, the expense part of the equation. I think that one of the things that we saw in emails that came in, suggestions that came in regarding the tax increase, was lower expenses. And, in an organization that's large, that's, I won't say easy to do, but it's certainly easier to do than when you only have 200 or so employees. In many departments, we have one employee who's responsible for doing that one job. And so if we eliminate positions, which is essentially how we would reduce expenses, we lose that function entirely. And certainly that's not something I think that the community wants us to do. So, I think if you also look at sort of history, the city went through that process of reducing expenses in 2009. As we saw the housing crisis, the credit crisis, the Great Recession, whatever name you want to give that period of time, City Manager Tuttle reduced expenses. And since then, we've still not recovered completely from those reductions, meaning we've not replaced all those changes that were made. And so there's not a lot of areas to turn to reduce expenses without impacting service. So I think the ultimate impact of not doing the 8 cent tax increase is that in the next 30 days, Barbara and I would have to sit down and decide how to reduce the operating budget. And that would absolutely include reduction of service.
Thank you. In the take-home vehicle program, I know you stated that's that for the police department, that Chief Dunn, not only as a recruitment tool, but a retention tool, and consideration given for maybe delaying that program and what impact that could have on the city's finances.
Sure. Just taking some notes. As I have said, I think already a couple of times, the number one priority for the police department is the take-home vehicle program. And we've been hearing that not just this year, but for the last 2 years. Chief Dunn has advocated for a take-home vehicle plan. And the reason that he advocates it is he feels strongly, as does his administrative staff, that having that take-home vehicle program will curtail in a major way the turnover that we experience in the police department. It's a benefit. It's really the only benefit that the city doesn't offer that you can get at a larger department. And, the one thing that we can't offer is the excitement of a big city, right? If you're a police officer that's looking for that adrenaline rush, you're not going to find that in Williamsburg. And frankly, you're probably not the right police officer for Williamsburg. But if you're just comparing the benefits, that take-home vehicle program is something that can be very attractive. In the city of Williamsburg, and I have said this to you already, is I'm not a police officer. I've never been a police officer. I've never been a police chief. So it's hard for me to fully appreciate the importance of that program. I can tell you that for many of our officers, the vehicle is their office, right? And so if you're having to share that vehicle day in, day out, rotation after rotation, that can be very frustrating, particularly if you're supposed to start your shift at a certain time and the officer is late returning because they're ending another call. And so you're at the station waiting on your shift to begin. The other thing to consider is the impact on the budget goes beyond just the cost of replacing personnel that leave, which is substantial. It also includes the fact that those cars are literally running all day, every day. There's hardly a moment that they are switched off. They refuel and they just continue over and over and over again. So we see a lot of turnover in the police department's fleet because we rack up miles so quickly. And without that period of rest, it can be very hard on the equipment. So in the preparation of evaluating the chief's proposal for a take-home vehicle program, we asked our maintenance department, our fleet services department, to consider how it would impact overall. And they think that over time, we will see a savings, and that savings starts to compound year over year as you get further out into the plan's implementation, because we won't be replacing vehicles as soon, and they will be getting that period of rest. We can also better sort of manage the type of vehicle that's purchased for the person who's going to be assigned to it, as opposed to right now, every vehicle that we buy has to be a police cruiser style vehicle, which of course has a lot of costs associated with outfitting it for police response. So those are some of the impacts. I would say that Chief Dunn is on vacation today, so he couldn't be here, but one of the things that happened, as I said earlier, when Ms. Dameron and I sat down and started looking at the shortfalls of the budget from the expenses to the revenues and tried to find ways to reduce expenses, increase revenue that didn't involve a tax increase, we immediately went to the department request and identified all the things that could be eliminated. And so in many cases, I called department heads and said, okay, you've requested this list of things. We can't accomplish any of them. But if we could accomplish one of them, what would be your top priority? And for the police department, overwhelmingly, that was the take-home vehicle program. And so the police department had a whole host of requests on the operating side of the budget, as well as the capital side of the budget, that were cut in favor of keeping this vehicle plan intact. And I think one of the things that we've not said it enough probably is that what's proposed is not a take-home vehicle for every officer on staff. It's a very small set of officers at the onset. And the chief is intending it to be a privilege, not a right, and reward not only his command staff for the jobs that they do, but also those officers who elect to live inside the city. And so while we don't have a policy written yet, those are the two things that we'll be considering as we do put that policy together.
Thanks. It was a great explanation. For me personally, and from my time in my previous position, I always said, it was obvious that there was a tax increase on the horizon if we were going to continue to provide the same level of service that our citizens are accustomed to, and what makes Williamsburg a desired community to live. I do hope that as a council we can take a look at this. I mean, 8 cents. I appreciate all the explanations that were given. I'm hoping that we could find a rate that was a little bit less than 8 cents, and what we would have to take out of a budget to meet that. But also in some way, I would like to see us. I know you mentioned it that the parking wasn't included, to maybe give the employees some type of compensation later in the year. But I would certainly like for this council to consider a way of finding to do that. Not just, I mean, it's been a tough year for everybody, but they've really they've really stepped to the forefront when they were needed, as always, during the pandemic. And I think it would be, it's well deserving that they be compensated for the work that they've done. And with that, I'll turn it over to other members of council.
Well, Mr. Vice Mayor, if I could, just one point I failed to make as I went through the budget message. I did say in a couple of different places that it was clear from our early discussions of the budget that the council's priority for unanticipated revenue, like we might see from a parking program revamp, should first be applied to staff increases. And so that will be our priority. As we get closer to adoption and we firm up those parking revenue numbers, that will be the target that we're chasing.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to reiterate the mayor and vice mayor's thanks to Drew, Barbara, and the rest of the staff for the great work they've done in putting together this presentation. Also want to give thanks to previous city councils and city managers. Williamsburg's value proposition to its residents has been one of the strongest in Virginia. To be able to provide the level of services our employees and partners provide to our residents, businesses, students, and visitors at a real estate tax rate, which is half the rate of our nearest neighboring city, needs to be recognized. And Drew, thanks for sending out your letter explaining the budget proposal. We've seen the full spectrum of responses to that. And just as importantly, we've heard from a wider range of stakeholders than we normally do. Which I think that's very good. Also, I want to thank Drew for following up on my questions about some of the budget details. And one of the notable ones, we've seen some questions come in on this. So, and Drew can correct me if my math is not correct. But some of the questions we were coming up with were before we talk about a rate increase in the real estate tax, what is the increase in revenue we're seeing from two different things. One would be for increasing our real estate base through Midtown Row and High Street development. And it looks like that's going to give us $485,000 in additional revenue just for that. And then the other one was, what's the increase in revenue for, we know that the assessment value of our real estate portfolio has gone up. What does that contribute to increased revenue? And that's about $503,000. So before we even talked about rate increases, we're looking at about $1 million increased revenue coming in just from the status quo because of our real estate portfolio, which I think is great. And then, I look forward to the further discussions on Thursday, but I do have one specific question on the wages, firefighter wages, because we know that we had this program where it was a graduated sharing of salaries for, I think, 4 positions with the federal government. There had been some talk about, and maybe it was COVID related, that there would be a longer 100% fund of that by the federal government. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as we were applying for the grant, I think it was in the final days of the grant's preparation and consideration, we were asked if we were going to be able to continue with the community match. And the positions were important enough to us that we did continue with the community match. Now that the grant has been awarded, there has been discussion of not requiring the community match from any of the communities that were awarded funds during this cycle for the lifetime of the grant. But that's not been confirmed yet. And so certainly that will help us greatly in future years as we don't have to match 100% of that funding. And so, if you remember the way that those grants worked, we got basically 4 positions and they were graduated funding over time. You start out with the lowest local share and graduate up to 100% of the cost over, I think it's 4-year period. So right now we're in the lowest cost share piece, but every little bit would help if we didn't have to make that match.
Thank you. Barb?
So thanks again. Just want to reiterate what everyone else has said as far as the detail in the letter and the information in the budget message as well. And I just have a few questions and comments, some that have been posed to me by members of the community. One was asking if there were additional types of taxes and fees that could be utilized, and in particular, the meals and lodging tax. And just wanted to confirm for the public that this is not something that we can do without General Assembly approval. And Drew, if you could just, or Barbara, touch on some of those taxes that we're limited to because of being a Dillon state.
Yeah, so I can start with that. In a Dillon rule state, basically a locality has only the authority that's granted expressly to it by the General Assembly. And so there are a whole host of revenues that we are not allowed to alter. One of those is a relatively new act by the General Assembly, and it relates to the meals and lodging tax and the possibility of an admissions tax. When the Historic Triangle tourism revenue legislation was passed, one of the trade-offs for that additional 1% sales tax was that we had to agree to freeze essentially our meals, lodging rates, and an admission tax could not be implemented inside the city. If we do any of those three things, it voids the legislation that created the additional sales tax, and we would lose that revenue. So the gain would be very nearsighted. So that's what limits those three sources of funding.
And that's an 8-year moratorium.
Right. One of the things that we did discuss, I think publicly, although with COVID-19, all the days sort of run together. I think we talked publicly about the possibility of implementing user fees. And one of those fees is about trash collection. That's one of the things that makes Williamsburg unique. I think maybe people don't realize that, but in many communities, you pay for trash collection. You either do that by buying coupons at the grocery store, what have you, or you just pay a flat fee for collection every month. In Williamsburg, you don't do that. It's built into the tax rate. So we did talk about, would the community prefer a trash rate as opposed to a real property tax increase? And it appears from the comments that we received that that's not the case. Most people are accepting of the real property tax rate that is proposed and understand the reason for it and would not desire a trash rate.
Because one way or the other, you're still paying for your trash, whether it's included in the services you get from the real estate taxes or from otherwise. And I did notice that even with for the meals tax that's projected in the FY22, that you're projecting revenue that pretty much brings us back, I think, to FY19. So I think, and I'm glad to see that's a very optimistic return for the meals tax revenue. I noticed that the lodging tax is still substantially lower, but as we have recognized throughout the past year, lodging has been hit much harder than the restaurants.
What we tried to do with this budget is we tried to recognize experience where we could. So, we looked back over the last year and adjusted revenues as we thought we could. And we always talk about when we do our budget that one of the strengths of our budget process is being conservative in revenue estimates, which helps us generate that surplus at the end of the year that's so important to our operational style. I think that I said to a lot of you earlier today that as Ms. Dameron and I sat down and looked at that shortfall in revenue compared to the expenses, we went back and looked at the revenue lines and sort of, I hate to say the word abandoned, but we walked away from that traditional conservative approach and did what I like to call be conservatively aggressive in our revenue estimates. And that really just means that I twisted Barbara's arm as far as I could on those revenue lines to make sure that we were getting what we needed to. And Mr. Maslin talked about it a little bit. One of the questions that we have seen quite a bit of is, what about the impact on our budget from new projects like Midtown Row or the new apartments at High Street, and the list goes on? Are they reflected in the budget? And the answer is yes, they are. But we have to be very careful because, one of the things that we know is that our period of adjustment of the budget goes well beyond its adoption, right? Our first point of collecting the tax is November, real estate tax. is December, I'm sorry. And so we've really got until November to make an adjustment to the budget's tax rate. So if revenues are outperforming our estimates substantially going in through the summer months into the first part of winter, then we may decide not to go forward with the full 8 cents. And the staff will certainly bring to you a recommendation that we alter the tax rate down prior to the first collection period. The thing that we don't want to do is overestimate revenues now and plan on returns from leasing at Midtown Road that don't materialize, because we won't be able to see those impacts fully until the February or March timeframe. And by that point, you've already had one tax collection. In fact, you've collected a whole host of taxes by that point. And so it's too late to make an adjustment that would really have any kind of impact in that fiscal year. And so the ramification of overestimating the revenue and adopting a lower tax rate than what we need is that at that point in the year, we would have to go further into the reserve to make up the difference and pledge a tax increase in the next fiscal year that would likely be even higher to correct the problems that were created by overestimating revenue. So we try really hard not to do that. So as I said, this budget is, we like to say, conservatively aggressive in our revenue forecasts, and we really hope we're wrong. I mean, I know that's crazy to say, but we really hope we're wrong, and we get to December, November timeframe and realize that we were too conservative even still, and we can lower our projected tax rate increase.
Thank you. I think there's also a saying that, my mother used to say, don't count your chickens before they hatch. So one has to be careful with that. And I had received questions about revenue from Midtown Row and High Street, so I'm glad Mr. Maslin mentioned that. Another question came in the form of, does it make sense to increase the rates in the utility fund? Would that help bridge the gap a little bit? And I think you provided some answers to the Vice Mayor and me this morning that you might want to share with the public as well.
Sure, yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Increasing utility rate, unfortunately, does not help us in the CIP or the general fund because, as I said, it's an enterprise fund. And so the revenues are sort of locked in that fund to pay for its own expenses. And if it generates a surplus, then that money goes into the fund balance for the utilities operation. The one exception to that is because the utility is operated by us, the city, and there are positions that do oversight like mine, like Ms. Dameron's for the utility fund, some portion of our salaries are cost allocated back to that. But outside of that, changes in the utility fund do not directly benefit the general fund or the CIP. So increasing those rates would not be a solution.
And you can't cost allocate 75% of your salary to the utility fund.
It wouldn't be fair, but I'll tell you, when I'm twisting Barbara's arm, I'm twisting the other one in that direction also.
When we were talking about the take-home vehicles for the police department, you mentioned other localities. Does James City County and York County provide vehicles for their police department to take home as well?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. And one thing I did appreciate too, when you were talking about the CIP, was just explaining and sharing that this is really about a lot of needs, not just once. I think sometimes people think that the CIP is, well, it's that money you collect and have left over and it goes for the niceties. But looking at the list, there are a lot of road projects included in there, some of which we also get funding from VDOT or elsewhere that is tied specifically to that project. So I think that's helpful as understanding as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you look at our CIP, we try to be as transparent as we can be. In fact, I think the CIP right now is as transparent as any I have seen in terms of where the money goes and where it comes from. At the top of that list, you can see all of the various grants and revenues that come into the CIP from sources, including the sales tax, including the transfer from the general fund. But what people really should note is how much grant funding we apply for, some of which we receive, some of which we don't. There are at least 3 projects right now on the plan that have to do with stormwater erosion. We receive a lot of emails from people that live in the Walnut Hills neighborhood about an outfall there that needs to be repaired. There's some outfalls out on Merrimack Trail and Capitol Landing Road that need to be repaired, and those are very costly projects. Mr. Clayton in Public Works, along with our consultant in DC, are applying for some funding from the federal government right now through Congresswoman Luria's office that would help offset some of those costs. So, you know, we're being as forward thinking as we can in terms of grant applications to help reduce the overall cost of those necessary projects in the CIP, as you said. You know, some people have said, if you can find $900,000 worth of projects in the CIP that could be postponed, are they really necessary? And I think the answer is, in some cases, no, they're not necessary. But when you're talking about a safe route to school sidewalk along a very busy street, yeah, that's a necessary project for the folks that live and use that facility. So it's really difficult to draw the line between necessary and wants. So what we do in those situations is postpone where possible and eliminate where is practical. So, you know, a good example would be in the police department. One of the projects that they asked for was improvement to their range facility, desperately needed. Erosion concerns, there's berm issues with the where they fire the rounds into, and obviously that's a critical component of the training for the police department. But we just couldn't afford it this year, so we pushed that out again and are looking for ways to reduce those costs by doing some of that work in-house and being creative on what we end up doing out there. So again, we're doing all that we can to manage those projects that still accomplish the needs and the wants of the city.
Well, and I think a good example is the multi-use trail at Monticello. Some people may have thought, well, that's a nice thing to have, add a walkway and a bike trail, but the city with College of William and Mary went after a number of grants and got those over a time period. And you just look at the difference that it's made, not only for quality of life, but also for safety issues. So it's been a huge improvement. So I don't have any other questions. I just want to bring out some things that had been asked of me to make sure that was included. I appreciate all of the clarity, and I don't see any area where you could really cut back anymore to reduce the increase that's been asked for. So thank you.
I'll start, of course, by echoing my council colleagues' points and how grateful we are for the amount of outreach that you've done, Drew, and members of your team. I actually, for Easter, traveled to see some family, and we found in a named locality that we traveled to that there was a property tax increase, but not one that had been a letter coming to the house letting people know, and not one that had a significant amount of outreach. So I think that would be the easier thing to do, is to be a little quieter, but certainly we were trying to be upfront. Two questions. One of the things you touched on earlier was the importance to us for the city to have a strong credit rating. Could you describe a little bit why it has been the policy to have a healthy reserve fund of 35% and of 40%, which we were working up to, instead of, as we're at 31% right now, just saying, look, let's get to 30 and not have to do this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. You know, in a lot of communities, 35% would be well beyond what they would need to feel safe in terms of dealing with an emergency that would come along. But in the city of Williamsburg, an emergency in our budget can take all kinds of forms. You know, the tragic shootings that occurred in Virginia Beach not that long ago would really damage our tourism economy. And we would need the reserve to overcome that. A hurricane in the same year. You know, we're really positioned at a point where our economy is particularly vulnerable to such changes. That's why we try to manage for 35%. The reason that Barbara and I would advocate for a sort of an operational practice of having 40% is so that when minor blips come along, we can accommodate them without going below the financial policy. You know, one of the things that we try to do is make sure that the city is positioned to constantly be moving forward. And the more we dip into the reserve, the more time we have to spend trying to recover and catch up before we can get back to that forward progression. And so that would be our strategy. And again, that's that's why we try to keep such a healthy balance in the reserve, is so that when these issues come along, we're prepared to deal with them. I would go as far as to say that the city of Williamsburg probably was one of the communities in the state of Virginia best prepared for the pandemic because of our healthy reserve, and hopefully we don't continue to see impacts, but if we did, our healthy reserve would continue to see us through it. But there comes a time when you've got to say, we can't keep dipping into that savings account because, at the rate you're spending, eventually it will be zero. And like I said, the longer you rely on your savings, the more time it takes you to pay it back. I think all of us have had the experience of spending years and years and years saving money in a savings account of our own and think, wow, look at the balance, I'm going to take a vacation. And then you go and you spend that money in a weekend, and then you spend another 5 years trying to save it back. And, I think the city's finances work a lot the same way. It doesn't take long to spend it, and it takes a really long time to save it.
Thank you. Another way, of course, that we try to maintain that healthy reserve rate is being very conservative in some of the revenues that we're projecting in the years to come. So I'm hopeful that we won't see just a short-lived bubble of demand with people getting back out into the traveling. But could you talk a little bit about if there are revenues above the levels that have been projected right now? For instance, parking is in the budget as a zero at the moment, and we are able to satisfy some of the well-deserved merit increases from our 220 strong staff. What might that money be used for elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. So if revenues come in stronger than we projected, as you said, our first priority is going to be staff increases. As a manager, I really don't like to give increases mid-year, but this is one time where I think it's probably the best plan, because then we can better gauge what revenues are going to be, particularly if those increases are based on the parking system that's new to us. If revenues outperform even those needs, then our first priority would be repaying the reserve as quickly as possible. Get back to 35% as fast as we can, because that levels the playing field. We're healthy again in the reserve, and then we can turn our attention to the CIP needs. There are two things in the CIP that we can do to help us think about lowering the tax rate sooner rather than later. The first thing would be to go back to the strategy of building a school system reserve that helps us pay for those projects over time. So if we had unrealized revenue, or if we had revenue that exceeded our projections and exceeded those needs in staffing, we would first go to rebuilding the reserve in the general fund, and then building a savings account to deal with school projects in the CIP. And then the next stop would be to go back to funding some of those expenses that were postponed in the CIP. As I said, again, we really dialed back to try and pause progress. So the sooner that we can catch up to where we were, the faster we can get to realizing those goals that were set by the community through our vision and goal statement process. So that's what we would do. And then the final stop would be, of course, rolling back to tax rate. If revenues really come in strong prior to December, that's a conversation we will definitely be having. We advertised 8 cents, and if you adopt 8 cents, when we get to November, we can really decide, do we really need the 8 cents or not? We haven't sent out the tax bills yet. That's our last opportunity to make a change. And I don't want people to have false hope right now, right? So we're going to plan on 8 cents. That's what the city budget needs. But if we get to November and we don't need it, absolutely, we will decrease the rates and the tax bills will be lower because of it.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point, that we don't want people to have false hope that would be a certainty, but it's at least admirable that we are considering the lowering, because it'd be easier to, as we have incrementally raised it over the years, if we had done that, it has maintained at 60 for a while, consider that the new floor in which it would not be lowered from there. So I guess I'll say a quick point before we'll discuss more on Thursday in the future, but initially in seeing the budget recommendation, saw 8 cents and thought, okay, it can't go above that, but it very well can go below that. Maybe there would be some room to shift around, but to realize that the proposed raise is not a bargaining piece in which we say 5 and you say 6. The proposed raise is at 8 cents right now because that is the necessity of revenue that we need to collect so that we are able to adequately address the the aging police and library buildings, the schools that are above capacity. And I think you all highlighted very well, you and Ms. Dameron and Ms. Herrick, that the cuts were made significantly across departments, and departments recognize they have to forego things like training for the police example that you gave, the renovations needed to their firing range to actually make sure that we were not overspending this year. So come to recognize that that increase is certainly necessary. Like I said at the beginning, I think it's easier to say nothing and to have raised it. So that certainly goes to the character of our city and actually mailing out something like over 6,000, I believe it was, letters to property owners within Williamsburg. I'm very interested to see the policy that we'll pursue in identifying the levels that in years to come may have us take back the raise, which has been proposed today. And I think it's, like I said, very admirable that we're already considering that. That's all I have to say for now, and I'll look forward to discussing more. But again, thank you all very much for all the outreach you've done to the community. And I think I recognize too the idea that what you have proposed is a necessity, not something that we are doing only because there are wants that we have, but instead needs.
Thank you.
Thank you, members of council. Just in general about the structural imbalance, this is not something new. I can think back to my days on council when Mayor Hallman was still with us, and we were talking about the tension between revenue and expenses and how things were shifting even back then with declining revenues, room and meals tax particularly. I can think way back to when room and meals tax were close to 2/3 of our annual revenue budget. Today, that's not the case. And our expenses are still going up. And I used by way of an example with a former council member just the other day that when they served on council, the employer share of healthcare costs for the city was in the $250,000 range. Today, it's in excess of $2 million. Those are real expenses that we have no control over. And I think to Councilman Rogers' point, the 8 cent is based out of necessity. It's not out of new wants. But with going back to the structural imbalance, one of the things that previous councils and this councils have really worked to try to achieve is setting aside funds for new tourism product. We recognized then when we created that we needed to put forward some form of self-help. We needed to try to bolster our tourism economy so that we can drive revenue for lots of reasons, but this is one of them. We knew that over the years we were artificially supporting our capital improvement plan with budgeted overage, reserve funds, not reserve funds, but backfilling our CIP with the budget overage. So, and those days are gone. So we can't do that anymore. And I really think that fixing that structural imbalance has been well talked about by the city manager today, is an important part of the health of our city moving forward. I did want to challenge staff to look at personal property tax. We always use as a benchmark what our neighboring communities charge. We are below what our neighbors charge. We're at $3.50 per 100, and I think our neighboring jurisdictions are at $4. I'd like to know what a 25 cent and a 50 cent increase would mean in terms of revenue, and how that might affect the real estate tax. And I know that comes with some implication. Generally those who own real estate are probably better off financially and can afford it. Those without homes, living, renting, would be impacted by personal property tax, probably in a more regressive way. But I think if we look at that, it might be a way to share the burden that the city faces today in a more equitable manner, because it's not just the property owners that are the beneficiaries of all of the things that the city supports through its budget. I'd asked the city manager, how many parcels of land there are in the city, and there's some 4,600, and there's 3,500 rounding off owners. And so just on the surface of that, it seems disproportionate of the burden to be just on the real estate owners. And so I would like to look to see what those two amounts are, 25-cent increase or a 50-cent increase, how that may affect our real estate fees. But also I'd like to consider it potentially as a way to look at employee raises. I don't want us to get behind on what we pay our employees. As you all know, we went through a pay in class study several years ago, which was about a $700,000 annual impact, and that number keeps growing every year. And that, as city manager and I talked about this morning, helped put us in this predicament that we're in today in terms of the structural imbalance. And I don't want to see us get upside down with our employees. And so, again, want to look at what that revenue figure would be for personal property tax. And then maybe over the course of the month, we can talk about how those funds can be deployed, whether it's to offset some real estate tax or whether we use it to support our staff. So I look forward to getting that. And I guess one of the other components of that increase, and I don't know how challenging it would be to get, I know the Commissioner of Revenue is the keeper of this information. Of those two increases, 25 or 50 cent, how much of that would be borne upon the traditional resident versus how much of that would be borne upon businesses in the city? Those would be the two payers of personal property tax. So I hope that's not too challenging to get. So those would be my ask. Again, thank you for the presentation and all the work that's gone into this. Mr. Trivette, do you have any final comments, or council members, do you have any other parting words on that?
No, I mean, the only thing I would say is absolutely we'll pull that information together and give that to you. If not on Thursday, then certainly next month at the May work session. I guess the only other thing to say is that, and Councilman Rogers pointed it out, I think often in a community when a tax rate a tax rate increase is suggested, a city manager, the administration of the city would propose a rate slightly higher than what is needed, knowing that there would be some process of negotiating down with the city council. And that is not what we've done here. That's just not, I mean, I hate to say it this way, that's just not my style. I would much rather tell you what I think is absolutely necessary. And the way that you can check my math on that is, as I said, that $8,000 in the CIP at the end of the planning horizon. I said to Ms. Dameron when we started looking at tax increases as the last resort for balancing the budget moving forward, Barbara, it's got to work, right? We can't propose a rate that doesn't work. It can't be too much. It can't be too little. It's got to be just right. And so that's how we landed at the 8 cents, because it comes back at just barely funding those CIP plans that we have. $8,000 balance at the end of that horizon is pretty remarkable given that increase. And of course, we know that by the time we get to year 5, a lot will have changed, both in the cost of the projects and in what we think is necessary. And by then, who knows, maybe we've lowered the rate back down. But to get to that number, that $8,000 is the bellwether of, did we shoot too high or shoot too low? And I think we're right on the mark.
Okay. So hearing no other comments, we'll move on in our agenda to item number 5, City Council communications. Does anybody, Mr. Maslin? Yes, sir.
A couple. So this Saturday, April 10th from 8 a.m. to noon, just want to remind everybody, is the Household Chemical Collections and Computer Recycling at War Hill High School. That's a quarterly event. And then Saturday, April 24th, I've noted that that's our police department, fire department drug take back drive-through at the fire department. Drew, do you think that's still on schedule?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. And Sunday morning, in relationship to the trash cart coverage, I'll be walking through the Burns Lane neighborhood with a representative from their alliance and a representative from William Mary's Student Assembly from their sustainability group to start a discussion about sustainability issues and hopefully develop a neighborhood helping neighbors pilot program. So there'll just be 3 of us starting a discussion, and we'll see where that goes from there. And then 3 weeks ago, the Williamsburg Volunteer Fire Department sent out the annual fund drive letter. Although the volunteer first responders look forward to meeting our neighbors annually, going door to door, we're going to need to wait another year for that. Thank you, Mayor.
Anybody else? Okay, schedule of meetings, Mr. Trivette.
Yeah, so on the schedule, we have, of course, our regular meeting of the City Council on the 8th. The Board of Zoning Appeals will meet on the 6th. We have the EDA Business Roundtable, which I believe will feature Kathleen Powell of the William and Mary Cohen Career Center on April 13th at noon. And then the EDA will meet itself on April 14th, and the Planning Commission is scheduled for April 28th.
Okay, takes us to our second open forum. Any callers online, sir?
Actually, we don't have any
Okay,
people waiting to speak.
all right. So I think we have one item for closed session, Vice Mayor.
Yes, we do. I move to go into closed session pursuant to section 2.2-3711 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing one personnel matter per subparagraph 1 concerning appointments to boards and commissions.
Second.
Mr. Rogers,
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey,
Aye.
Mayor Pons,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Dent,
Aye.
Mr. Maslin.
Aye.
Okay, so you all, members of council, have the meeting ID for the closed session meeting. We'll go to that, and when that adjourns, we'll come back to this meeting ID to conclude this meeting.